At my parents' opulent 40th anniversary gala, the clinking of crystal glasses silenced the ballroom. My older brother Julian, the supposed real estate mogul of our family, raised his champagne flute and looked directly at me. He smiled a wicked, knowing smile. To Kendra, he announced into the microphone, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. To the one who always shows up, broke, needy, and still hoping to matter. The room of 200 elite guests erupted into laughter. My own parents, sitting at the head of the table, chuckled and nodded in agreement. I did not flinch. I slowly stood up, lifted my glass of sparkling water, and stared right back into his eyes. To the desperate one, I replied softly yet loud enough for the microphone to catch. The laughter died instantly. The entire ballroom froze in shock. My name is Kendra, and I am 32 years old. I never expected to be the executioner of my own family legacy. But when blood relatives treat you like a peasant in their kingdom, you have no choice but to buy the castle and evict them. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the scapegoat of a toxic family and had to build your own table when they refused you a seat. The evening began exactly the way every gathering in my family did, wrapped in suffocating pretension. We were at the most exclusive country club in Atlanta. This was not just a dinner. It was a calculated display of wealth power and what my mother called black excellence. 200 of the city's most influential people were there. Politicians, corporate executives, and generational wealth heirs mingled under massive crystal chandeliers. The floral arrangements alone, cascades of white orchids and imported roses, cost more than what most people make in a year. My mother Vivian wore a custom beaded gown that caught the light with every step. My father Winston stood by her side in a tailored tuxedo, accepting congratulations from everyone who passed. They looked like royalty holding court. And then there was Julian. At 35, Julian was the golden child, the heir apparent to the family name. He paraded around the ballroom like a king, shaking hands and loudly discussing his upcoming luxury eco-resort project. He wore a velvet dinner jacket and an arrogant smirk that never seemed to leave his face. And me. I was the invisible daughter. I sat at table number 4, placed just far enough from the head table to show my rank but close enough to prove to the public that our family was united. I wore a simple black dress, no flashy diamonds, no designer logos screaming for attention. To them, I was just Kendra. The girl who rejected the family business, moved out at 18, and supposedly struggled to make ends meet in corporate America. They thought I was a mid-level employee drowning in student debt. They had no idea who I really was. For my entire life, I was the designated failure. If I got a bad grade on a test, it was proof I lacked focus. If Julian wrecked his expensive sports car, it was just boys being boys, and my father would buy him a new one the next day. They funded his every venture, his every mistake, and his every lavish vacation. When I asked for help paying for my college tuition, my mother told me that giving me money would be a poor investment because I lacked the aggressive edge needed to succeed. So I took out loans. I worked 2 jobs. I built my life in the shadows while they bathed in the spotlight. Sitting at that table watching them perform for the crowd, I felt a familiar coldness wash over me. The guests were dining on filet mignon and lobster tail, drinking vintage champagne, and praising my parents for raising such a wonderful son. Several of my aunts and uncles came by my table, offering me pitying smiles. They would pat my shoulder and say things like, "Keep working hard, sweetie. Maybe Julian will give you a job at his new resort." I simply smiled, politely, nodded, and sipped my water. I knew something they did not. I knew the velvet ropes they were standing behind were about to collapse. The jazz band finished their set, and the event planner signaled for the speeches to begin. My father took the microphone first. He gave a sweeping, grandiose speech about his marriage, his struggles, and how he had built an empire from the ground up to pass down to his brilliant son. He spoke of Julian with tears in his eyes, calling him the future of Atlanta real estate. Not once did he mention my name. I was entirely erased from his history. Then it was Julian's turn. Julian grabbed the microphone and stepped into the center of the dance floor. The spotlight hit him. He was in his element, soaking up the adoration of the 200 wealthy guests. He started with charming anecdotes about our parents drawing easy laughs and warm applause from the room. His wife Sasha sat near the front, clapping the loudest, her massive diamond ring catching the stage lights. Everything was going perfectly according to their script. But Julian could never resist an opportunity to elevate himself by stepping on my neck. It was his favorite sport. He turned his body toward my table. The spotlight shifted, casting a harsh glare on my face. Julian smiled a slow, predatory grin that I knew all too well. He raised his glass of champagne. And now he announced, his voice oozing with false affection. "I want to make a special toast to my little sister Kendra." The crowd murmured, turning their heads to look at me. My mother stiffened slightly, perhaps worried Julian would go too far, but my father just chuckled. Julian continued, pacing slightly like a courtroom lawyer. "You have always marched to the beat of your own drum. We admire your stubbornness, even when it leads you nowhere." He paused for dramatic effect. The room was deathly quiet now. "Let us raise a glass to the one who always shows up broke, needy, and still hoping to matter. Bless her heart for trying, right, folks?" A harsh, cruel laugh erupted from my father. My mother covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking with silent amusement. That was all it took. The rest of the room followed suit. 200 people, the supposed elite of Atlanta, were laughing at my expense. Women in diamond necklaces and men in tailored suits chuckled at the poor, pathetic daughter who could not measure up to her brother. The laughter rolled over me like a physical wave. For a split second, I remembered every time they had made me feel small. I remembered being 18, sitting in my cheap apartment eating plain pasta while watching their extravagant family vacations on social media. I remembered the loan officers, the sleepless nights, the relentless grind to prove I was worthy of taking up space in the world. But that insecure girl was long gone. The woman sitting at table number 4 was a titan. I placed my napkin neatly on the table. The laughter began to die down as people noticed I was moving. I stood up slowly, deliberately, making sure every single eye was fixed on me. I reached out and picked up my glass. It was not champagne, just water with a slice of lemon, but I held it like it was the most expensive drink in the room. I walked 2 steps away from my table, stepping directly into the edge of the spotlight that was meant for Julian. The ballroom grew quiet. They expected me to run out crying. They expected me to throw a tantrum, proving their narrative that I was unstable and jealous. Instead, I looked directly into Julian's eyes. His smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second, just enough for me to know he saw the shift in my demeanor. I raised my glass high. "To the desperate one," I said. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a scalpel. I did not use a microphone, but the acoustics of the ballroom carried my words to every corner. Because only a truly desperate man needs to mock someone else to hide his own collapsing world. Cheers. I took a slow sip of my water. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not just quiet, it was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. The kind of silence that happens right before a devastating storm makes landfall. The laughter had vanished completely. The smiles on my parents' faces had frozen into masks of confusion and rising panic. Julian lowered his glass, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the stem of his champagne flute. The air in the room grew instantly cold, and everyone watching knew that a line had just been crossed, one that could never be uncrossed. I set my glass down on the table with a soft clink that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. I turned my back on Julian, ignoring the hundreds of wide eyes staring at me, and began walking calmly toward the grand double doors of the ballroom. I knew exactly what would happen next. They could not let this go. My mother would never allow a public embarrassment to stand unpunished. As I stepped out into the quiet luxury of the velvet-lined corridor, I heard the rapid, angry clicking of expensive heels following right behind me. The first layer of their fake empire had cracked, but the real war was about to begin in the shadows. I barely made it 10 steps down the plush carpet of the hallway before manicured fingers clamped down hard on my bicep. The grip was shockingly strong. I was abruptly spun around my mother Vivian, glaring at me with a fury that threatened to crack her perfectly smooth foundation. Her eyes darted frantically up and down the corridor to ensure none of her wealthy friends had followed us. Once she confirmed we were alone, she pushed me toward an alcove heavily draped in velvet curtains. "What on earth is wrong with you?" she hissed, her voice trembling with a toxic mixture of rage and panic. "Are you completely out of your mind? You come to my anniversary gala, eat my food, and then try to humiliate your brother in front of the mayor." I calmly looked down at her hand. I did not pull away. I simply stared at her French manicured nails until she felt the sheer weight of my indifference and slowly let go. "You are embarrassing this family," my mother continued, smoothing the front of her beaded gown. "Do you have any idea who is sitting in that room tonight? We have city council members out there. We have the top real estate investors in the state of Georgia listening to every word Julian says. He is trying to secure funding for his eco-resort, and you decide to throw a tantrum because you are jealous of his success. You have always been jealous, Kendra. It is exactly why you will never amount to anything more than a glorified secretary. You have always tried to ruin his moments," Vivian spat, taking a step closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "When he graduated college, you just had to announce your little scholarship. When he bought his first house, you refused to show up to the housewarming. And now, on the most important night of my life, my 40th anniversary, you try to make him look like a fool. You stand in front of the elite of Atlanta and act like a street corner brat." I let out a slow, measured breath. I simply responded to a toast, Mother. If Julian did not want to be embarrassed, he should not have handed me a microphone disguised as an insult. He was making a joke, she snapped back instantly, defending him with blinding loyalty. He was trying to include you in the festivities. You are so sensitive, Kendra. You look at him and you see everything you failed to become. Her words about my supposed failures dragged my mind back to the brutal reality of my teenage years. I remembered the exact moment my parents informed me I was entirely on my own. I had just received my acceptance letter to a top-tier university. Instead of congratulations, my father sat me down and bluntly stated that my college fund had been liquidated. Julian needed the capital for a luxury car rental business, an endeavor that predictably crashed and burned before the year was out. When I cried and begged them to reconsider, my mother told me that investing in my education was a waste of resources because I lacked the aggressive edge required to build wealth. The financial abandonment was absolute. While my peers enjoyed the typical college experience, I took out high-interest student loans that felt like a permanent weight on my chest. I worked overnight shifts at a logistics warehouse, sleeping 3 hours a night before morning lectures. Julian, meanwhile, was gifted a brand new Porsche and handed the reins to a subsidiary of my father's firm. Every time Julian made a catastrophic mistake, my parents quietly covered his tracks with their own money. He was insulated from the consequences of his incompetence, elevated by their desperate need to present a successful black male heir to their social circle. They never realized that by throwing me to the wolves, they were teaching me how to lead the pack. While Julian was busy taking out exorbitant loans to maintain his facade of wealth, I was mastering the dark arts of high finance. I entered the cutthroat world of private equity, learning how to identify vulnerable assets and execute hostile takeovers. I weaponized the financial exile they forced upon me. They thought I was a harmless, low-level employee drowning in debt. They had no idea I spent my days destroying men twice as smart and 10 times as ruthless as my brother. Just as my mother opened her mouth to deliver another barrage of insults, the sharp, rhythmic clicking of high heels echoed against the marble floor. The suffocating scent of expensive perfume announced her arrival seconds before she stepped into view. Sasha, Julian's wife, strutted down the hallway with the aggressive confidence of a woman who believed her marriage certificate made her royalty. At 30, Sasha was the ultimate accessory to Julian manufactured image. She was striking, always perfectly styled, and completely obsessed with status. Tonight she was wearing a skin-tight emerald green gown that left little to the imagination. But the most prominent feature of her outfit was the massive cushion-cut diamond ring on her left hand, which she made a point to display with every exaggerated hand gesture. She came to a halt next to my mother, placing a manicured hand on her hip. Sasha looked me up and down, her lips curling into a sneer of pure disgust. "Look at you," Sasha said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Julian tries to do something nice, tries to make you feel included for once in your miserable life, and you pull a stunt like that. You really are classless, Kendra. You have absolutely no idea how to behave in high society." I remained silent, watching the two women tag team their assault. Sasha stepped closer, her eyes scanning my outfit. She let out a short, mocking laugh. "And what are you even wearing? Did you buy that off a clearance rack at a department store?" "We are at a country club, Kendra, not a funeral parlor. You could have at least tried to look the part, instead of showing up in that cheap, stiff little suit. It is honestly embarrassing to be seen with you." The irony was almost too sweet to bear. Sasha was currently mocking a custom-tailored suit woven from imported Italian wool, crafted by a private designer in Milan, who only accepted clients by referral. My outfit cost exactly $10,000 more than the entire down payment on the fake designer bags Sasha paraded around with. I did not wear loud logos or flashy diamonds because true wealth does not need to scream to be heard. But I kept that fact to myself. Letting them believe I was poor was the most crucial part of my strategy. My mother nodded vigorously in agreement with Sasha. "She is right. You look entirely out of place here. You are ruining the aesthetic of the entire evening. We spent months planning this gala to showcase Black excellence, and you look like you just got off a shift at a bank." Sasha crossed her arms, the diamond catching the dim light of the corridor. "You need to leave," she demanded, her tone shifting from mocking to authoritative. "Call yourself a ride and go back to whatever tiny apartment you live in. Julian is furious and he is about to speak with the investors again. If they see you wandering around looking like a bitter, broke sibling, it is going to reflect poorly on his brand. You are a liability to his business image. Do us all a favor and exit through the service doors so no one else sees you." I looked at Sasha, taking in her arrogant posture and the absolute certainty in her eyes. She truly believed she was untouchable. She believed the luxury cars, the massive house, and the diamonds were hers by right, completely oblivious to the rotting foundation they were built upon. She had married Julian for the money, and she guarded her position in the family like a vicious guard dog barking at anyone she deemed beneath her. I let a small, razor-thin smile cross my face. "I am not going anywhere, Sasha," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "In fact, I am just getting started. If you want me out of this club, you are going to have to physically drag me out, and I highly doubt you want to risk wrinkling that rented dress." Sasha gasped, her eyes widening in outrage. Her face flushed a deep shade of crimson. "Rented? How dare you? This gown is custom." Before she could launch into a screaming fit, the heavy oak doors at the end of the corridor pushed open. My father Winston stepped out into the hallway. His face was grim, his jaw set in a tight, uncompromising line. He did not look at my mother or Sasha. His eyes locked directly onto me. "Kendra," he barked, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Julian, Sasha, and your mother, all of you, get into the VIP boardroom right now. We have family business to discuss, and we are going to settle this tonight." My father did not wait for my response. He turned on his heel and marched down the corridor, his heavy footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. I followed him, my mother and Sasha trailing behind me like a pair of anxious vultures. Julian was already waiting by the entrance of the VIP boardroom, leaning against the polished mahogany frame. He had abandoned his public smile. Now he just looked exhausted and cornered. The VIP boardroom of the Atlanta Country Club was designed for the kind of conversations that altered the city landscape. It was completely soundproof with heavy velvet curtains drawn tightly over the floor-to-ceiling windows. A massive oval mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. Winston ushered us all inside. The moment my mother crossed the threshold, my father pulled the heavy oak door shut. I heard the unmistakable click of the brass lock engaging. The silence in the room was absolute, a stark contrast to the lively jazz music echoing in the ballroom just down the hall. My father walked to the head of the table and sat down, gesturing for the rest of us to take our seats. Julian and Sasha took the chairs on his right, sitting close together to form a united front. My mother sat on his left. I remained standing near the door, my arms crossed over my chest. "Sit down, Kendra," my father ordered, his voice echoing slightly in the large empty room. "We do not have much time before people start wondering where the guest of honor has gone." I slowly walked to the far end of the table, taking the seat directly opposite him. I did not lean back in the leather chair. I sat on the edge, my posture perfectly straight, my eyes locked on him. "I am listening," I said quietly. My father let out a heavy sigh, running a hand over his face. He looked older in the harsh overhead lighting, the stress of maintaining his empire finally beginning to show in the deep lines around his mouth. "Julian Resort Project has hit a snag," he began, his tone clinical and detached, as if he were discussing the weather rather than the potential collapse of his golden child business. "He needs a temporary liquidity injection to satisfy some impatient investors and keep the construction moving forward." I raised an eyebrow. A snag. That is an interesting way to describe a catastrophic failure of management. Julian slammed his hand on the table, glaring at me. "Shut up, Kendra. You do not know the first thing about commercial real estate development. You sit in a cubicle all day. You have no idea the kind of pressure I am under to keep this family name relevant in Atlanta." I ignored Julian completely, keeping my focus entirely on my father. And what does Julian failure have to do with me? Why am I locked in a soundproof room while 200 people drink your champagne in the next room? My father reached into the breast pocket of his tuxedo and pulled out a thick document. It was bound in blue legal backing, the crisp white pages stark against the dark wood of the table. He slid it across the polished surface. It stopped exactly 3 inches from my hands. "Your grandmother left you a trust fund," my father said slowly, watching my face for any reaction. $2 million to be accessed when you turn 35. We need that money now, Kendra. Julian needs it to bridge the gap until his next round of funding comes through. I stared at the document. It was a complete relinquishment of rights. They were asking me to sign away the only thing my grandmother had ever given me. The only piece of my family legacy that had not been tainted by their favoritism and greed. Grandma Dorothy had been the only person in this family who saw me. She knew how my parents treated me, and she had quietly set up the trust fund to ensure I would never be completely destitute. I did not need the money now, but the principle of the matter ignited a cold, quiet fury in my chest. "You want me to give Julian $2 million?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "So he can pour it into a failing resort project that has not broken ground in 6 months. It is a loan," Sasha interjected, her voice shrill and defensive. "Julian will pay you back with interest as soon as the resort opens. You should be honored to help the family instead of being so selfish." I finally turned my gaze to Sasha. "Do you understand what liquidity means, Sasha? It means cash. And if Julian is desperate enough to try and steal his little sister trust fund, it means he is completely out of cash. It means the banks have cut him off. It means the private investors have stopped returning his calls. It means he is drowning." Julian's face flushed dark red. "I am not drowning," he yelled, standing up from his chair. "I am managing a complex portfolio of assets. You would not understand the strategy if I drew it in crayon for you. Just sign the damn paper, Kendra. It is family money anyway. It should have gone to me in the first place. I built this brand. I am the face of this family." I looked back at my father. "And if I refuse to sign, what is your plan?" Winston leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. His expression was completely devoid of paternal affection. He looked at me exactly the way he looked at a hostile competitor in a boardroom. "If you refuse to sign," he said quietly, "we will challenge your mental competence in court. We will argue that you are unfit to manage such a large sum of money. We have doctors who will testify to your history of emotional instability. We will tie that trust fund up in litigation for the next 2 decades. You will spend every penny you earn paying lawyers just to fight us. And in the end, you will lose." The threat hung in the heavy soundproof air. It was a masterclass in manipulation and extortion. They were prepared to destroy my reputation, drag my name through the mud, and bankrupt me in court, all to protect Julian ego and his failing business. My mother finally spoke up, her voice trembling with a terrifying blend of desperation and malice. "Do not force us to do this, Kendra. Just sign the paper. You have a decent job. You do not need that money. Julian is building a legacy. He is carrying the family name. You owe him this. You owe us this. For all the years we put a roof over your head and fed you." I looked at the three of them. My father, the ruthless patriarch willing to crush his own daughter to save his son. My mother, the enabler who believed that Julian's success was the only metric of her own worth. And Julian, the golden child, arrogant and completely incompetent, hiding behind his parents' money and power. They truly believed they held all the cards. They believed I was trapped. They believed they could break me with a single legal document and a few hollow threats. They had absolutely no idea who was sitting across the table from them. I did not reach for the pen. I slowly leaned back in my leather chair, steepling my fingers together. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to sit in the suffocating tension of their own making. Julian wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. Sasha nervously twisted her massive diamond ring. My father, jaw tightened, clearly frustrated by my lack of compliance. "You think you have this all figured out, do you not?" I said softly, breaking the silence. "You think you can lock me in a room, threaten me with a fabricated lawsuit, and steal my inheritance to plug the holes in Julian's sinking ship?" I reached out and pulled the document closer to me. I did not open it. I simply traced the edge of the paper with my index finger. "You hired expensive lawyers to draft this. You probably paid them a retainer that could have covered a month of Julian construction costs. But you made a fatal error, Winston. You underestimated your opponent." My mother slammed her hands flat on the table, leaning forward so far I could smell the sharp tang of gin on her breath. "I am done playing games with you, Kendra," Vivian snarled, dropping her polished society matriarch facade entirely. "You think you can sit there and talk down to us? You think you are untouchable in your little corporate job just because you ran away from your family. You are nothing. And if you do not sign that paper right now, I will make sure you lose everything you have managed to scrape together in your pathetic life." I tilted my head, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. "Is that a threat, Mother?" "It is a promise," she replied, her voice dropping to a venomous hiss that echoed in the soundproof room. "Do you remember the summer you turned 20? The summer you begged your father for an internship and worked in the accounting department of our real estate firm?" I remembered it perfectly. It was the only time I had ever been allowed inside the family business, and they had me filing invoices in a damp, windowless basement room while Julian occupied a corner office on the top floor. We still have the digital logs from that summer. My mother continued, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across her heavily made-up face. And Julian just happened to find some alarming discrepancies in the archives. It turns out someone embezzled nearly $50,000 from the corporate accounts that year. Someone whose employee login credentials match yours perfectly. My father looked away, suddenly finding the wood grain of the mahogany table utterly fascinating. Julian smirked, crossing his arms over his velvet dinner jacket. It was a complete and utter fabrication. They had cooked their own books, created fake ledgers, and framed me for a crime that never happened. They had held this forged evidence in their back pocket for a decade just in case they ever needed a heavy leash to control me. "We have the forged documents ready to be sent directly to the district attorney," Julian chimed in, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Embezzlement is a serious felony, Kendra. We also have a special package prepared for the Human Resources Department of your current employer. How long do you think you will keep your precious little cubicle job when they find out you stole from your own family? You will be fired by noon, arrested by dinner, and completely ruined for the rest of your life." They waited for the explosion. They expected the tears, the screaming, the desperate begging that usually follows when a person realizes their own flesh and blood is willing to send them to federal prison over a cash dispute. Sasha was literally leaning forward in her leather chair, practically vibrating with excitement, eager to watch my absolute destruction. She looked like she was watching reality television. I felt my pulse against my wrist. It was completely steady. The sheer audacity of their plan did not terrify me. It liberated me. Any lingering shred of familial obligation I might have held on to evaporated instantly in that soundproof room. They had just given me permission to absolutely destroy them without a single ounce of guilt. I did not scream, I did not cry, I did not beg for mercy. I reached into my leather tote bag. The smooth motion caught them off guard. Julian flinched slightly, perhaps thinking I was reaching for my phone to call the police. Instead, I pulled out a sleek black leather case. I opened it, retrieved my Tom Ford reading glasses, and deliberately slid them onto my face. Then I reached out and pulled the thick blue-backed legal document to the center of my personal space. I opened the cover page and smoothed the crisp white paper flat against the table. "What are you doing?" Sasha snapped, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "She just told you you are going to jail. Did you not hear her?" "I am reading the terms of my surrender, Sasha," I replied calmly without looking up from the page. A smart woman always reads what she is signing, even when she has a gun pointed at her head. I began to read. The room was deathly quiet, save for the crisp sound of the pages turning. I took my time. I read every single clause, every subsection, every hidden contingency. For 10 solid minutes, the only sound in the room was the rustling of paper and the increasingly heavy breathing of my brother. As a senior mergers and acquisitions specialist who routinely dissected billion-dollar corporate contracts for breakfast, this document was absolute child play. It was the legal equivalent of a toddler finger painting. When I reached page 12, a soft, genuine laugh escaped my lips. I could not help it. It started as a low chuckle and grew into a clear, bright sound of pure amusement. I shook my head, tapping my manicured nail against a dense block of legal text. Julian's face tightened. "What is so funny?" he demanded, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. He hated being laughed at more than anything else in the world. I took off my reading glasses and rested them on top of the contract. I looked directly at him, my eyes filled with mocking pity. "Who drafted this for you, Julian? Was it the expensive law firm downtown, or did you hire a first-year law student off the internet to save a few bucks?" Winston frowned deeply, finally looking up from the table. "We use Harrison and Vance. They are the top corporate attorneys in Atlanta. We pay them a massive retainer." "Well, Winston, you need to call them tomorrow morning and ask for a full refund," I said, leaning forward and turning the document around so it faced them. "Because Harrison and Vance just served your golden boy on a silver platter. Let us look at Section 4, Clause B, the indemnity clause." I pointed firmly to the paragraph. This clause states that upon the transfer of the trust funds, the recipient assumes all prior tax liabilities associated with the capital gains of the principal amount. "Do you even know what that means, Julian?" Julian swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the text. "It means you pay the taxes before you hand the money over to me." I smiled a wide, terrifying smile. "No, Julian. It means the exact opposite. My grandmother trust was heavily invested in high-yield tech stocks that have appreciated significantly over the last 15 years. The capital gains taxes on a sudden $2 million liquidation will be roughly 40%. By signing this specific document, I transfer the money to you, but the tax liability transfers right along with it. The Internal Revenue Service will be knocking on your door for $800,000 within 30 days of the transfer. Do you have $800,000 in liquid cash to give the federal government, Julian?" Julian's face drained of all color. He looked like he had just been punched in the stomach. He looked at my father, sheer panic flashing in his eyes. "Dad, is that true?" Winston snatched the document across the table, hastily putting on his own glasses to read the clause. His jaw clenched tight as his eyes scanned the legal jargon. He realized instantly that I was completely right. "But wait, there is more." I continued, my voice bright and conversational, driving the knife in deeper and twisting it. Turn to page 19. The subordination agreement. Your high-paid lawyers drafted this assuming the trust is entirely liquid cash sitting in a checking account. It is not. 30% of the trust is tied up in municipal bonds that do not mature for another 5 years. If you try to force an early withdrawal, there is a massive penalty fee applied by the bank. Furthermore, this amateur contract completely fails to account for the generation-skipping transfer tax. You thought you were stealing $2 million tonight. In reality, after the taxes, the penalties, and the inevitable IRS audits, you would be left with barely $600,000. And Julian still needs $15 million to save his sinking resort project. I sat back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. You brought me in here to extort me for a life raft. But the raft you built is full of holes, and you are too financially illiterate to even realize you are drowning. Sasha looked utterly horrified. She turned on Julian, her voice rising in pitch until it was almost a shriek. You told me this was a sure thing. You told me we were getting $2 million tonight to pay off the contractors and save the house. You absolute idiot, did you even read the paperwork before you brought it here? Shut up, Sasha, Julian hissed, his hands trembling slightly as he grabbed the contract back from Winston. He was sweating profusely now. Fine beads of perspiration lined his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled appearance. He loosened his silk tie, suddenly finding it hard to breathe in the climate-controlled room. He looked exactly like what he was, a trapped, incompetent animal. Winston was completely silent. He looked at me, truly, looked at me perhaps for the very first time in my adult life. The dismissive, arrogant, paternal glare was gone from his eyes, replaced by a cautious, highly calculating stare. He was a ruthless businessman above all else, and he had just watched the daughter he had always dismissed as a failure expertly dissect a complex financial trap in under 10 minutes without breaking a single sweat. You understand complex contracts, Winston said slowly, his voice tight with an unfamiliar emotion that sounded dangerously close to respect. I understand power, Winston, I corrected him coldly. I understand leverage, and I deeply understand that a man who has to threaten his own daughter with fake embezzlement charges just to save his son is a man who has completely lost control of his empire. My mother stood up violently, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. Her face was twisted in ugly rage. You arrogant little brat! I do not care about the tax clauses or the municipal bonds. I will still send those forged ledgers to the police. I will still ruin your life if you do not find a way to fix this mess right now. I picked up my reading glasses and placed them back in their sleek case. The sharp snap of the leather case echoed like a judge gavel in the quiet room. Go ahead, Vivian. Send them. Call the police right now. In fact, let me dial the district attorney direct line for you. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, sliding it across the polished mahogany table toward her. Call them. Because the absolute second you submit those fake ledgers, you commit federal fraud. And when the FBI inevitably investigates, they will not just look at my fictional internship. They will look at the entire corporate history of Julian shell companies. They will find the commingled funds, the heavily inflated appraisals, and the offshore accounts he has been using to hide his mounting debts from the investors. You think you have a gun pointed at my head, but you are actually holding a live grenade, and I am the only person in this room who knows the pin has already been pulled. I pushed the blue-backed contract across the polished mahogany surface. It slid smoothly, stopping right at the edge of the table near Julian. I am not signing your amateur paperwork, I stated, my voice devoid of any warmth. I am not giving you a single dime of my inheritance. And if any of you ever threaten me with fabricated evidence again, I will personally ensure you spend the next decade buried under federal indictments. The room went entirely still for a fraction of a second. Then Julian snapped. The polished veneer of the confident real estate mogul shattered completely. He slammed both of his fists onto the table with such violent force that the heavy wood shuddered. He sprang out of his leather chair, his face contorted into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage. You ungrateful little witch, he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. You think you are so smart. You think you can just walk in here and ruin everything I have built. I am the one carrying this family. I am the one making sure we still have a seat at the table in Atlanta. You owe me this money. Julian was panting heavily. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. Sasha shrank back in her chair, visibly startled by the sudden violent outburst from the man she usually saw as smooth and collected. Even my mother, who had been ready to send me to prison moments ago, looked slightly alarmed by the sheer feral intensity of her favorite child. I did not flinch. I did not move back. I just sat there and watched him unravel. It was pathetic. This was the man my parents had chosen over me. This grown man throwing a temper tantrum in a luxury country club because his little sister refused to surrender her money to cover up his gross incompetence. "Sit down, Julian," I commanded, injecting every ounce of authority I possessed into those 3 words. I sounded like a judge addressing an unruly defendant. "You are embarrassing yourself. And more importantly, you are lying to the people trying to save you." Julian remained standing, breathing hard, but he did not speak. His eyes darted nervously. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. "Let us cut the nonsense, Julian. Let us talk about why you are actually sweating through your silk shirt tonight. Let us talk about the magnificent eco-resort in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The one you have been bragging about to the mayor and the city council all evening." I held his gaze, locking him into the reality he had been desperately trying to avoid. "Why do you need my $2 million so badly, Julian? Why are you willing to commit extortion for a measly $2 million when you currently owe the bank $15 million for a resort that has not seen a single construction crew in over 6 months?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that physically presses against your eardrums. $15 million, I repeated slowly, letting the massive number hang in the air. "Secured by short-term, high-interest commercial loans that you defaulted on 3 weeks ago. You told everyone tonight that the project was experiencing minor supply chain delays. But the truth is, the contractors walked off the site in April because their checks bounced. The architectural firm sued you for unpaid invoices in May. And the environmental permits you bragged about securing were actually revoked because you tried to bribe a county official to overlook a protected wetland on the property." I watched the blood completely drain from Julian's face. He looked like he was going to vomit right there on the mahogany table. Sasha let out a short, high-pitched gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked at her husband, waiting for him to laugh, waiting for him to tell me I was crazy. But Julian just stood there, swaying slightly, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. "You thought you could keep juggling the debt?" I continued, my voice steady and relentless. "You thought you could take money from one project to pay the interest on another. But the market shifted, the interest rates climbed, and your lenders finally realized you were running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme disguised as a real estate development firm. You are totally and completely illiquid. You have no cash. You have maxed out your lines of credit. You even drained the employee payroll accounts last Tuesday just to pay for the caterers for this anniversary gala, so Mom and Dad would not suspect anything was wrong." Julian collapsed back into his chair. He looked physically ill. "That is a lie," he whispered weakly, staring blindly at the table. "She is lying. She is just trying to make me look bad. She does not know anything about my business. She is just a corporate drone." Winston slowly stood up. He had been quiet for too long. He looked at me, then looked at Julian. The older man's posture was rigid, his face an unreadable mask of hardened business acumen mixed with sudden rising terror. "What is she talking about, Julian?" my father demanded, his voice dangerously low. "Look at me. What is she talking about? You told me the Blue Ridge project was fully funded. You showed me the quarterly projections last week. You said the company was bringing in record profits." "They are," Julian stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room like a trapped rat. "We are. The company is highly profitable. Kendra is just making up numbers. She probably hacked into a dummy file or something. Do not listen to her dad. You know how she is. She just wants to destroy my reputation." "You showed him forged projections," I interjected smoothly, "just like the forged embezzlement ledgers you tried to use against me. You are very good at faking documents, Julian. I will give you credit for that. But faking a spreadsheet does not put concrete in the ground. And it certainly does not stop the bank from calling your loans." Winston ignored me. He walked around the edge of the table and grabbed Julian by the shoulder, hauling him around so they were face to face. I am asking you a direct question as the primary seed investor in your firm. Winston growled, his grip tightening on Julian's jacket. Do you owe the bank $15 million? Have the contractors walked off the site? Answer me right now, or I swear to God, I will call my forensic accountants tonight and have them rip your entire company apart by morning. Julian's lips trembled. He looked at his father, the man who had given him everything, the man whose approval he had spent his entire life chasing and exploiting. He tried to maintain the lie. He opened his mouth to deny it again, but the sheer weight of my father's stare, combined with the absolute certainty in my voice, broke him. It is just a temporary cash flow issue. Julian whimpered, his voice breaking. The market was volatile. The suppliers raised their prices. It was not my fault. I just needed a little more time. If Kendra would just give me the trust fund, I could pay the past due interest and get the crews back on site. I can fix this, Dad. I promise I can fix this. Winston let go of Julian's shoulder as if he had just been burned. He stumbled back a half step, his eyes wide with horror. You lied to me, Winston said, his voice barely a whisper. You sat in my office, you drank my scotch, and you looked me in the eye and lied to my face while you burned my money to the ground. It is not your money, Vivian cried out, suddenly standing up and rushing to Julian's defense. Winston, stop interrogating him. He is your son. Business is hard. Things happen. We can mortgage the summer house. We can sell some stock. We can fix this together as a family. We just need to stay calm and figure out a strategy. Winston slowly turned his head to look at his wife. His expression was a terrifying mix of betrayal and disgust. Fix it. Vivian, did you not hear what Kendra just said? He does not just owe a few $100,000. He is in the hole for $15 million. And he committed fraud to get there. If he falls, he takes everything down with him. Our name, our reputation, our entire legacy in this city, it is all gone. Sasha was hyperventilating now. Her perfectly manicured hands were shaking violently as she clutched her expensive designer handbag. $15 million, she repeated, her voice cracking. Julian, what did you do? Where did all the money go? We just bought a new yacht last month. You told me we were richer than ever. Julian buried his face in his hands, unable to look at any of them. The yacht was leased, he muttered through his fingers. And the leasing company is threatening to repossess it next week. The room descended into a chaotic spiral of accusations and panic. Vivian was sobbing, clinging to Julian's arm, while Winston paced the length of the boardroom, running his hands through his thinning hair. Sasha was practically shrieking, demanding to know how they were going to maintain their lifestyle if the banks seized their assets. They had completely forgotten I was even sitting there. They were too busy watching their glittering empire turn to ash right before their eyes. I watched them turn on each other like starving wolves. This was the family that had laughed at me just an hour ago. This was the family that had called me a failure, a disappointment, a desperate woman clinging to their coattails. Now they were tearing each other apart over the very lies they had used to build their superiority complex. I felt absolutely nothing for them. No pity, no sadness, just a profound sense of validation. The first domino had finally fallen, and the rest were lined up perfectly, just waiting for the final push. What do we do? Winston asked the room. Though he was mostly talking to himself, his voice was hollow, stripped of all its usual commanding power. We need to find a way to restructure the debt. We need a bridge loan. We need to contact the primary lender immediately and negotiate terms before they file the public default notices. I sat quietly, tracing the edge of the mahogany table with my finger. I knew exactly what they were going to do next because I had orchestrated this entire scenario down to the minute. They were about to make a desperate plea for mercy. They were about to beg the bank for more time, and they were about to discover that the bank they owed their lives to was not a faceless institution in New York. It was me. Despite my revelation, Julian could not let his fragile ego die an honest death. He scrambled to his feet, adjusting his silk tie with shaking hands. It is a slight over-exaggeration, he stammered, looking frantically between my father and mother. Dad, listen to me. I have a meeting with the loan officers on Monday. I just need to show them some additional collateral. If Kendra will not help her own blood, I have other private investors lined up. We are not going under. She is just twisting the facts to make herself look like the smartest person in the room. I realized then that words were never going to be enough for these people. They had spent their entire lives treating truth as a flexible commodity, bending reality to fit their arrogant narratives and massive egos. To break the delusion, I needed to show them the hard, undeniable data. I did not argue with him. I simply picked up my phone from the mahogany table and tapped the screen twice. The VIP boardroom was equipped with a state-of-the-art 80-inch smart television mounted on the far wall, designed specifically for high-stakes corporate presentations. I had quietly synced my phone to the room network the moment we walked through the door. The massive screen hummed to life, casting a harsh, bright glow over their panicked faces. Julian spun around to face the screen. His jaw dropped. "Look closely, Julian," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet, soundproof room. "Because these are the facts you continually refuse to face." On the giant screen, a highly confidential legal document appeared in crystal clear high definition. The bold black letters at the top read, Chapter 11, Bankruptcy Petition. Below it was the exact legal name of Julian Primary Holding Company, along with his personal signature already inked on the draft line. The date on the document was from 2 weeks ago. "This is the draft your attorneys prepared when the first bank sent their acceleration notice," I narrated, swiping my phone screen to scroll through the pages. "You have not filed it yet, because you were hoping to extort $2 million from me tonight to pay the massive retainer fee required to start the proceedings. You have $42 million in total liabilities across 6 different shell companies and less than $50,000 in liquid cash. You are not just broke, Julian. You are catastrophically in debt." Winston let out a strangled gasp. He stumbled toward the television screen, his eyes wide, reading the itemized list of creditors. I swiped my phone again, and a new document flashed into view. It was a formal notice of default from the primary commercial lender. The numbers were highlighted in stark red ink. $15,420,000. Past due. "And here is the reality of your beautiful eco-resort," I continued, relentlessly swiping to bring up a sprawling collage of legal summons. Lawsuits from the structural engineering firm, the concrete suppliers, and the electrical union. They are not just suing your development company. They are suing you personally because you recklessly signed personal guarantees on every single one of these vendor contracts. They are going to take your cars, your bank accounts, and every single piece of property you have your name attached to. Winston clutched his chest, his face turning a terrifying shade of gray. He collapsed heavily into the nearest leather chair, struggling to draw breath. He had built his reputation over 40 years of careful, calculated business moves. He had survived recessions, market crashes, and fierce competitors by being incredibly smart and deeply conservative with his capital. And now he was sitting helplessly watching his golden child vaporize his entire legacy in high definition on an 80-inch screen. "You fool!" Winston wheezed, pointing a violently trembling finger at Julian. "You arrogant, stupid fool! You signed personal guarantees. I taught you better than that. I taught you how to insulate the assets. I showed you how to protect the core portfolio. I thought the project was a sure thing." Julian cried out, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "I needed the cash fast, and the bank demanded the guarantees before they would release the funds. I was going to refinance once the resort opened and buy out the initial terms. It was a calculated risk, Dad. You take calculated risks all the time." "A calculated risk." Winston roared, suddenly finding his voice again. His chest heaved as he slammed his open hand against the armrest of his leather chair. "It is financial suicide. You have exposed our entire family to these creditors. If they pierce the corporate veil, they will come after my assets too, because my stupid name is listed as a silent partner on your original charter. You have destroyed us. You have absolutely destroyed everything I worked my entire life to build." Vivian stood completely frozen, staring at the screen as if it were a physical monster crawling out of the wall. The brutal reality of the situation was finally penetrating her thick, impenetrable shield of denial. She realized that the Chapter 11 bankruptcy meant the absolute end of her reign in Atlanta high society. It meant the country club memberships would be revoked by the end of the month. It meant the charity galas would stop sending her VIP invitations. It meant the other wealthy wives who currently admired her would soon be laughing mercilessly behind her back. She turned her head slowly, looking at Julian as if he were a complete stranger. Her favorite son, the boy she had worshipped and protected from every consequence since he was a child, had just signed away her luxurious life. "How could you do this to me?" Vivian screamed, her voice shattering the tension like a thrown brick through a glass window. The sudden shift in her demeanor was utterly terrifying. The fierce, protective mother vanished instantly, replaced by a vicious, cornered socialite fighting for her survival. "I gave you everything. We bought you the best private education. We bought your first company. We covered up every single mistake you ever made. And this is how you repay me. By bankrupting my husband and making me the ultimate laughingstock of this city." "Mom, please listen to me," Julian begged, taking a desperate step toward her with his hands raised. "I can fix this. We just need to pool our remaining resources. We can sell the beach house in Hilton Head. We can liquidate some of the blue-chip stocks." "Do not touch me!" Vivian shrieked, recoiling from him as if he were highly contagious. "Sell the beach house. Are you out of your mind? That house has been in my family for 3 generations. I will not let you pawn off my inheritance just because you are too wildly incompetent to manage a simple construction project." I watched the united front against me completely disintegrate in real time. They were no longer the proud, powerful family looking down on the disappointing daughter. They were a pack of rabid animals locked inside a cage, violently tearing each other apart to save their own skin. My father was clutching his chest, muttering curses at his son, while trying to calculate his own financial exposure. My mother was screaming about her ruined social life and destroyed reputation, entirely unconcerned with Julian's actual well-being. Julian was standing in the middle of the wreckage, crying and screaming back at his parents, completely stripped of his arrogant facade. The velvet dinner jacket he wore now looked like a costume on a terrified little boy. He kept pointing at the television screen, trying to explain away the massive numbers, but his voice was drowned out by Vivian's relentless shrieking. I sat back in my leather chair, perfectly still and perfectly quiet. I watched the chaos unfold with the detached, clinical interest of a scientist observing a volatile chemical reaction. They did not even notice me anymore. I was no longer the target of their rage. I was just the catalyst that had exposed the deep-rotting decay lying beneath their polished exterior. This was the absolute truth of my family. There was no loyalty here. There was no unconditional love or support. There was only mutual exploitation, masquerading as a familial bond. The moment the money disappeared, the moment the status was threatened, they turned on each other with a viciousness that was truly breathtaking to witness. The bonds of blood meant absolutely nothing when compared to the threat of losing their luxury cars and exclusive memberships. I looked at the television screen where the $15 million default notice still glowed brightly, casting a red shadow across the room. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction settling in my chest. For 32 years, I had been the scapegoat. I had been the one blamed for every minor inconvenience, the one expected to shrink myself so Julian could look taller. Today, the illusion was permanently shattered. The screaming matched, escalated. Vivian was now threatening to call her own lawyers to see if she could legally separate her assets from Winston before the creditors arrived. Winston was yelling at her to shut up, telling her she was being hysterical and useless. Julian was begging them both to stop fighting and help him figure out a strategy. It was a symphony of destruction, and I had orchestrated every single note. But I knew the performance was not quite over. There were still a few more layers to peel back. I reached out and gently tapped my phone screen, turning the television off. The sudden darkness in the room was startling, but it did nothing to stop the screaming. The digital guillotine had dropped, but the blood was still spilling, and the worst was yet to come. I sat in my chair, watching the spectacle with cold fascination. The absolute speed at which their loyalties dissolved was a masterclass in human greed. There was no unconditional love here. Their entire existence was a transactional arrangement, and the currency had just run out. Sasha paced the length of the boardroom, her emerald gown swishing violently around her ankles. She pulled out her phone, her thumbs flying across the screen. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was transferring whatever liquid cash remained in their personal checking accounts into an account solely under her name. She was draining the lifeboats before the ship even fully sank. Vivian collapsed back into her chair, pressing her hands against her temples. Her perfectly coiffed hair was beginning to fray at the edges. The stress of the evening was aging her by the second. She looked over at my father, who was standing perfectly still near the head of the heavy mahogany table. "Winston," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Do something. You are the head of this family. You have to fix this. You cannot let them take our lives away." Winston did not respond immediately. He stared at the blank wall where the television had been projecting their financial doom. His chest rose and fell in deep, heavy breaths. For decades, my father had been the ultimate patriarch. He ruled his company and his family with an iron fist, demanding absolute perfection and projecting an image of untouchable power. To see him now cornered by his own son incompetence and facing public ruin was a monumental shift in the universe. Suddenly, Winston slammed his fist onto the table. The sound cracked like a whip in the soundproof room. "Enough," he roared. His voice was so loud and so filled with absolute authority that even Sasha stopped texting and looked up. Winston glared at all of them, his eyes burning with a desperate, furious energy. "Stop screaming like a pack of rabid dogs. We are not dead yet. We are the Wilson family. I did not build this empire over 40 years just to let it crumble in a single night, because my son is a fool and his wife is a coward." Sasha opened her mouth to argue, but Winston pointed a sharp, commanding finger directly at her face. "I said enough, Sasha. You file for divorce tomorrow if you want to. But tonight, right now, you are going to sit down, shut your mouth, and let me handle the business. If you walk out that door and breathe a single word of this to the people in the ballroom, I will personally ensure you get absolutely nothing in the settlement. I will drag the divorce out in court for a decade until your lawyer fees bankrupt you. Do you understand me?" Sasha glared at him, but the threat worked. She knew Winston had the resources to make her life a living hell if he chose to. She snapped her phone shut and practically threw herself into the nearest leather chair, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. Winston turned his attention back to Julian. His gaze was devoid of any paternal warmth. It was the cold, calculating look of a CEO trying to salvage a hostile takeover. "Pull yourself together, Julian," Winston commanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, dangerous register. "Wipe your face. You look like a pathetic child. We need a strategy, and we need it right this second." Julian hastily wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, sniffling loudly. He looked terrified of his father. "Yes, Dad." "Okay, what do we do?" "The bank sent the default notice 3 days ago. They gave us 72 hours to cure the default, or they seize the assets. That deadline expires tomorrow morning at 9. Winston began to pace the length of the room, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. He was running through his mental Rolodex, calculating every possible favor he could call in, every political connection he could exploit. "We cannot cure a $15 million default by tomorrow morning," Winston muttered, thinking out loud. "We do not have the liquidity. Selling off assets takes time. We need a bridge, we need an extension." He stopped pacing and looked sharply at Julian. "Who holds the primary paper on this loan? Which bank sent the acceleration notice?" Julian swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously. "It is not a traditional bank, Dad. I could not get a traditional bank to underwrite the second phase of the resort because of the zoning issues. I had to go to the private sector. I used a private equity firm." Winston's face darkened. "Private equity. You put our family assets up as collateral to a private equity firm. Do you have any idea how aggressive those sharks are? Who is it? Give me the name of the firm." Julian's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the mahogany table. "Apex Capital," he whispered. The name dropped into the room like a lead weight. Winston froze. Even Vivian, who rarely paid attention to the specifics of corporate finance, let out a sharp gasp. Apex Capital was not just a firm. In the Atlanta financial district, they were a terrifying legend. They were known as the corporate Grim Reapers. They specialized in acquiring distressed debt, moving in with ruthless efficiency, and stripping the assets of failing companies down to the studs. They did not negotiate. They did not offer second chances. They came in, they foreclosed, and they liquidated everything to maximize their returns. Apex Capital. Winston repeated, the color draining from his face once again. You borrowed $15 million from Apex Capital. Are you completely insane, Julian? They are bloodhounds. They probably knew you were going to default before you even signed the paperwork. They structured this specifically to trap you and take the underlying real estate. I did not have a choice, Julian cried out defensively. They were the only ones willing to give me the capital without requiring a board seat. They promised me favorable terms if I could hit the initial construction milestones. But you did not hit the milestones, did you? Winston fired back, his voice thick with disgust. Because you were too busy leasing yachts and throwing extravagant parties to actually manage the construction site. And now Apex is going to swallow us whole. Winston resumed his pacing, his steps faster and more frantic now. He was a cornered animal, realizing for the first time that his usual tactics might not work. He could not intimidate a firm like Apex. He could not charm them at a charity gala. They only cared about the bottom line, and Julian's bottom line was heavily in the red. We have to call them, Winston said, finally stopping at the head of the table. We cannot wait until tomorrow morning. If they file the public foreclosure notices at 9 a.m., the media will have it by noon. The scandal will tank my company stock before the market closes. We have to stop them tonight. Call them, Vivian asked, her voice trembling. Winston, it is almost 10 o'clock at night. You cannot call a corporate office now. Nobody will be there. Winston waved a dismissive hand at her. Money never sleeps, Vivian. The executives at Apex are not working bankers' hours. They are probably sitting in some high-rise downtown right now, waiting to hit the execution button on our lives. I have to get ahead of this. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out his phone. I know a guy who sits on the advisory board of the local Chamber of Commerce. He told me once that he plays golf with one of the senior partners at Apex. I am going to call him right now. I am going to get the direct line to the CEO of Apex Capital. Sasha let out a bitter, mocking laugh. And what exactly are you going to say to the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm, Winston? Please do not take my son toys away. He promises to be a good boy next time. Winston glared at her with such pure hatred that Sasha actually shrank back in her chair. I am going to do what I have always done, Winston growled. I am going to negotiate. I am going to offer my own core commercial properties as secondary collateral to secure a 90-day extension. I will pledge my own holding company to guarantee Julian debt. Dad, no! Julian gasped, genuinely shocked by the offer. If you pledge your holding company, you are putting everything on the line. Your entire life work. If I cannot get the resort funded in 90 days, they will take your company too. Winston looked at his son with a mixture of profound disappointment and lingering duty. You think I want to do this, Julian. You think I want to risk the empire I built from scratch to cover your massive failures. I have no choice. If our name is dragged through the bankruptcy courts, my company loses its credit rating anyway. We are tethered together. You made sure of that when you forged those projections and lied to me. I am doing this to save my own legacy, not your ego. Winston unlocked his phone, his thumb hovering over the keypad. He looked around the room, taking in the ruined, terrified faces of his family. Listen to me, all of you, he commanded. I am going to get the CEO of Apex on the phone. When I make this call, I demand absolute total silence. Do not breathe heavily. Do not shift in your chairs. If this CEO thinks for 1 second that we are panicked or desperate, they will smell blood in the water and they will gut us. We project strength. We project stability. He began to dial the numbers of his contact. I sat completely motionless at the far end of the mahogany table, my hands neatly folded in my lap. I watched my father prepare to grovel. I watched the great Winston Wilson, A man who had spent my entire life making me feel small, prepared to beg a stranger for his financial life. He was about to offer his entire empire as collateral to a private equity firm, completely unaware that the founder, CEO, and majority shareholder of that very firm was sitting exactly 10 feet away from him, wearing a custom $10,000 suit he had just allowed his daughter-in-law to mock. The phone began to ring on speaker. The sound echoed in the soundproof VIP boardroom, a rhythmic mechanical pulse that counted down the final seconds of their fabricated reality. I kept my face perfectly neutral, but inside my heart was beating with a steady, triumphant rhythm. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. And the jaws were about to snap shut. The speakerphone on Winston's device emitted a sharp electronic tone, echoing loudly off the mahogany walls. 1 ring, 2 rings. Winston stood straight, adjusting his tie, pulling his shoulders back to project the image of a titan ready to negotiate. He cleared his throat, preparing the perfect opening line, a carefully crafted blend of respect and unyielding authority. Sasha stopped her frantic texting to watch him, her emerald green dress rustling softly. Julian leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his entire future hanging on whoever picked up the other end of that line. Vivian held her breath, clasping her hands tightly together in a silent, desperate prayer. 3 rings. Just as the 4th ring began on his device, a bright, piercing chime interrupted the heavy silence. It was my phone. The sleek device sitting face up on the polished mahogany table directly in front of me lit up, vibrating aggressively against the hard wood. Everyone flinched. Winston shot me a look of pure, lethal annoyance. "Turn that off, Kendra," he hissed, his voice an angry whisper. "I told you I needed absolute silence. Turn it off right now before they pick up." I did not rush to silence it. I simply tilted my head, looking down at the glowing screen. The caller ID flashed brightly in the dim room. It displayed the exact name of the man Winston was currently calling. Martin Vance had given my father the direct executive bypass line, the one reserved strictly for high-level corporate emergencies. My father's speakerphone rang for a 5th time. My cell phone vibrated in perfect synchronization with the sound. Ring, vibrate, ring, vibrate. The coincidence was too glaring to ignore. Julian noticed it first. His bloodshot eyes darted from the speakerphone in Winston's hand to the glowing screen on the table in front of me. His brow furrowed in deep confusion. "Why is your phone ringing at the exact same time?" Julian asked, his voice shaking slightly, as a new, completely foreign kind of terror began to take root in his mind. I reached out and picked up my phone. I looked directly into my father's eyes. He was glaring at me, still waiting for the apex executive to answer his call. "Because Winston is calling me," I said softly. I tapped the red button on my screen. Instantly, the ringing on Winston's speakerphone stopped. The automated voice of my personal corporate voicemail filled the room, broadcasting loudly from the device in my father's hand. "You have reached the executive office of the Chief Executive Officer at Apex Capital. I am currently unavailable. Please leave a detailed message and my legal team will review your inquiry." Winston stared at his phone as if it had just turned into a venomous snake. He looked at the screen, confirming the number he had dialed, and then looked back at me. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The connection was too impossible for his arrogant mind to process. He had spent his entire life categorizing me as a failure. The idea that I could be on the other end of that phone line broke his fundamental understanding of reality. "That is a mistake," Vivian stammered, breaking the suffocating silence. She let out a nervous, hollow laugh. "The network must be crossing the wires. Hang up and dial again, Winston. She is playing some kind of sick joke with her phone settings." I did not say a word. I set my phone down. I opened my designer tote bag, the one Sasha had mocked earlier in the evening, and pulled out a slim, matte black card holder. I snapped it open. I extracted a single heavy piece of metal. It was a custom laser-engraved business card forged from solid black titanium. It felt cold and weighty in my hand, a physical manifestation of the power I had quietly accumulated over the last decade. I placed the metal card on the polished mahogany table. I placed my index finger on top of it and pushed. It slid smoothly across the long table, the metal whispering against the wood. It traveled the entire length of the surface, coming to a perfect stop right in front of Winston. "Read it," I commanded. My voice was no longer the quiet, respectful tone of a daughter. It was the razor-sharp, uncompromising voice of a Wall Street titan. "Read it out loud, Winston." My father's hands were visibly shaking as he reached down and picked up the heavy black titanium card. He held it up to the light of the chandelier. The laser-etched silver lettering caught the light brightly. His eyes scanned the text. He swallowed hard. The silence in the VIP boardroom was so profound, I could hear the faint ticking of the vintage grandfather clock in the corner. "Read it," I said again, my tone dropping to a dangerous absolute zero. Winston's lips parted. When he spoke, his voice was a fragile, broken rasp, completely stripped of its usual booming authority. "Kendra Wilson, founder, Chief Executive Officer, Apex Capital." The words hung in the air, heavy and lethal. The shockwave hit the room with the force of a physical explosion. Vivian let out a sharp, gasping breath, raising a trembling hand to cover her mouth. Her eyes widened to the point of tearing as she stared at me, seeing me for the very first time. Julian slumped backward in his chair, his face completely devoid of color. He looked like he was going to pass out. Sasha dropped her phone onto the floor. The clatter of her device hitting the hardwood floor was the only sound in the room. She stared at me with pure, unadulterated horror. I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers together. I let them drown in the realization. I watched the arrogant illusions they had built their entire lives around crumble to dust in a matter of seconds. "You," Julian whispered, his voice cracking violently. "You are Apex. You are the one who bought my debt." I nodded slowly. "I am Apex. I built it from the ground up, while you were busy failing upward on our parents' dime. I started by acquiring small distressed assets. Then I moved into commercial foreclosures. I built a multi-billion-dollar private equity fund, right under your noses, operating anonymously through various holding companies, because I knew exactly how you would try to exploit my success if you ever found out." But how Vivian cried out, tears of panic finally spilling over her heavily powdered cheeks. "How could you do this? We are your family. How could you buy your own brother debt and threaten to destroy him?" "I did not threaten him, Vivian," I corrected her coldly. "Julian destroyed himself. He took out massive loans he could never repay. He committed extensive fraud. He lied to his investors. The traditional commercial banks were going to seize his assets and file federal criminal charges months ago. The only reason he is not currently sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting trial is because I stepped in and quietly purchased the paper on his debt before the federal investigators got involved." Winston was still staring at the black titanium card in his hand. He looked completely defeated. The proud patriarch of the Wilson family, a man who had demanded total submission from everyone around him, was now holding the undeniable proof that he had been thoroughly outplayed by the daughter he had constantly thrown away. "You knew," Winston said, looking up at me. His eyes were hollow and defeated. "You knew he was defaulting, you knew he was completely bankrupt, and you bought the debt anyway. Why? Why would you expose yourself to a $15 million loss?" "Because it is not a loss, Winston." I smiled, a cold, predatory expression that made Julian physically flinch. "Apex Capital does not take financial losses. We take valuable assets." I knew Julian was defaulting because my team of financial analysts had been tracking his fraudulent shell companies for 2 years. When the banks got ready to foreclose, I swooped in and bought the debt for pennies on the dollar. I own the paper on the Blue Ridge Eco Resort. I own the paper on his commercial leases downtown. I even own the secondary mortgages he secretly took out on his own residential properties just to cover his payroll. I stood up slowly, dominating the space in the luxury boardroom. I walked around the edge of the mahogany table, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I did not buy the debt to save him. I bought the debt to own him. I bought the debt because I knew that the day would eventually come when he would finally run out of other people's money to steal. And I wanted to be the exact person holding the executioner axe when he did. Julian began to sob loudly. Real desperate ugly tears streamed down his face. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking violently. "Please, Kendra," he begged, his voice muffled by his palms. "Please do not do this to me. I will do anything you want. I will sign the entire resort over to you. I will give you all the remaining equity. Just please do not foreclose on me. Do not take my house. Do not ruin my name in this city." "Your name is already completely ruined, Julian," I said, stopping right behind his leather chair. I looked down at his pathetic, trembling form with absolute disgust. "You ruined it the moment you decided to play billionaire with a negative bank account. You ruined it the moment you decided to forge embezzlement records to frame your own sister tonight just to extort my trust fund. You thought I was a desperate broke outcast hoping to matter. You thought you could lock me in this soundproof room and squeeze me for cash." I looked across the table at Sasha. She was absolutely paralyzed. She was staring at me like I was a terrifying ghost. She realized that every single mocking comment she had made about my clothes, my career, and my lifestyle was a catastrophic mistake. She had just insulted the billionaire woman who held the absolute legal right to repossess the luxury car she drove and the mansion she slept in. "And as for you, Sasha," I said softly, "you were right about one thing earlier tonight. We are not playing games anymore. You wanted to call a divorce lawyer to secure your assets. I highly recommend you make that call immediately, because by tomorrow morning, there will be absolutely no assets left for you to take." Winston placed the black metal business card carefully on the table. He stood up, trying to muster whatever tiny shreds of dignity he had left. He looked at me, his face a complex mixture of fear, awe, and complete submission. He was a seasoned businessman facing a hostile corporate takeover he could not possibly stop. "What are your terms, Kendra?" Winston asked quietly, his voice broken. "What do you want from us? You have proven your point. You have won this war. We surrender completely. What will it take to stop the foreclosure filings tomorrow morning?" I looked at my father. I looked at the man who had denied me my college tuition just to buy his spoiled son a sports car. I looked at the man who had laughed at my expense just an hour ago in a ballroom full of elite guests. I felt a supreme, absolute clarity wash over me. "There are no terms, Winston," I replied, my voice echoing with absolute finality in the soundproof room. "There is no negotiation. There is no extension. The default deadline expires tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. I am not here to bail you out. I am here to collect." I remained standing at the head of the mahogany table. The shift in power was absolute and irreversible. For my entire life, I had been the one looking up from the bottom of the well, listening to their judgments and absorbing their casual cruelties. Now, I was the one holding the spotlight, casting a long, terrifying shadow over their crumbling dynasty. I reached back into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of manila folders. I dropped them onto the polished wood. They hit the table with a dull, heavy thud that made Julian physically jump. "These are not draft agreements or amateur legal threats," I said, my voice sharp and clinical. "These are the finalized court-approved notices of default and foreclosure. They have already been signed by a judge. The ink is dry. The public filings go live on the county database tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. But since we are family, I thought it would be polite to deliver the hard copies in person." I picked up the first folder and slid it across the table toward my brother. Julian stared at it as if it were a bomb rigged to explode. "Open it, Julian," I commanded. "Look at the empire you thought you built." With trembling hands, he opened the folder. His eyes scanned the top page, his face draining of whatever tiny bit of color had managed to return. "The commercial real estate portfolio you love bragging about is completely gone," I explained, pacing slowly down the length of the boardroom. "You defaulted on the loans for the downtown high-rise complex 3 months ago. Apex Capital bought the paper. You defaulted on the strip malls in Midtown. Apex Capital bought that paper too. And the crown jewel, your precious Blue Ridge Eco Resort, the project you just tried to steal my trust fund to save, is now fully owned by my firm." Julian let out a pathetic whimpering sound. But the equity, he pleaded weakly. There has to be some equity left. I put $5 million of my own cash into the foundation work. You put $5 million of Winston cash into a swamp? I corrected him coldly. The environmental fines you incurred completely wiped out any remaining equity. You are upside down on every single property. When my liquidators move in next week, they will strip the steel from the ground and sell it for scrap just to cover the legal fees you generated. You are walking away with absolutely nothing. No company, no portfolio, and no future in Atlanta real estate. I picked up the second folder. It was significantly thicker than the first. I did not slide this one to Julian. I slid it directly to my father. Winston looked down at the label. He did not open it. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. Vivian leaned over, her eyes wide with frantic curiosity. "What is it, Winston?" she asked, her voice shrill and trembling. "What else does she have?" "Why do you not tell her, Winston?" I said, leaning over the table and resting my hands on the smooth mahogany surface. "Tell your wife what you leveraged to secure the secondary funding for Julian failing business. Tell her what you quietly signed over to the bank 6 months ago when you realized your golden boy was drowning in debt." Winston closed his eyes. He looked like an old broken man. He could not bring himself to speak. "Fine," I said, straightening my posture. "I will tell her, Vivian. Your magnificent 10-bedroom estate in Buckhead, the house with the heated pool, the imported marble floors, and the manicured gardens where you host your exclusive charity luncheons, is heavily mortgaged." Winston took out a massive loan against the primary equity to cover Julian's shortfalls. When Julian defaulted, Winston defaulted. And naturally, Apex Capital swooped in and acquired the mortgage. Vivian let out a guttural, horrifying scream. It was not a polite society gasp. It was the raw, primal shriek of a woman who was having her entire identity surgically removed without anesthesia. "No," she shrieked, slamming her hands against the table. "No, Winston. Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not mortgage my house. My grandfather built the west wing of that estate. You promised me it was protected." Winston slowly opened his eyes and looked at his wife. "I had to, Vivian," he whispered, his voice hollow. "Julian needed the cash to keep the creditors at bay. I thought we could refinance once the resort opened. I thought we had more time." "You gambled my home!" Vivian screamed, standing up and grabbing Winston by the lapels of his tuxedo. "You gambled the only thing I care about to save this useless, pathetic boy!" She shoved Winston backward and turned to me, her face contorted into a mask of pure desperation. "Kendra, please, you cannot take the house. It is the family home. You grew up in that house. Your childhood bedroom is still exactly the way you left it." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. My childhood bedroom was a prison cell, painted a color I hated, in a house where I was treated like an unwanted guest. Do not try to invoke nostalgia, Vivian. It will not work. I hold the primary mortgage, and you are 90 days past due. The foreclosure notice is in that folder. You have exactly 30 days to pack up your designer clothes and vacate the premises. If you are not out by the 1st of next month, I will have the county sheriff physically remove you and your belongings from the property. Vivian collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her arms, sobbing hysterically. Her perfect world was completely annihilated. She was going to be homeless, stripped of her address, her status, and her pride. I turned my attention to the far side of the table. Sasha had pushed her chair back, trying to make herself as small as possible. She was clutching her designer handbag against her chest like a shield. She watched me approach with wide, terrified eyes. She knew she was next. I picked up the third and final folder. It was incredibly thin. It only contained a few sheets of paper. I tossed it lightly onto the table in front of her. Sasha flinched as the folder landed. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over Vivian loud sobbing. "I did not sign any loans. I did not guarantee any of Julian debt. You cannot touch me. I am filing for divorce, remember. I am separating my assets." I smiled down at her. It was the same cold, calculating smile she had given me in the hallway when she mocked my tailored suit. "You cannot separate assets that you do not actually own, Sasha." She looked confused, her perfectly threaded eyebrows knitting together. "What are you talking about?" "I am talking about the aesthetic, Sasha. I am talking about the billionaire lifestyle you love throwing in my face. Let us talk about that beautiful, shiny black Mercedes G-Wagon you drove to the country club tonight. The one parked right outside the main lobby in the absolute best VIP spot. Sasha gripped her handbag tighter. It is my car. Julian bought it for my birthday. Julian leased it for your birthday, I corrected her, my tone dropping to a deadly whisper. And he leased it through one of his commercial holding companies to write it off as a business expense. When that holding company went into default, all of its physical assets became property of the creditors. Which means, as of yesterday afternoon, Apex Capital holds the physical title to that vehicle. I own your car, Sasha. Sasha mouth opened in silent horror. She looked at Julian, waiting for him to deny it, waiting for him to tell her that at least her luxury vehicle was safe. But Julian just stared at the floor, too broken to even look at his wife. You cannot take my car. Sasha finally managed to say, her voice cracking. How am I supposed to get home? How am I supposed to take the kids to their private school tomorrow? You can call an Uber, I suggested calmly. Or perhaps you can walk. I really do not care. But you will not be driving that vehicle off the country club lot tonight. In fact, if you look out the window of the ballroom right now, you will probably see the tow truck I hired hooking it up to a winch. Sasha leaped out of her chair and ran to the heavy velvet curtains covering the boardroom windows. She tore them open and pressed her face against the thick glass, peering out into the darkened parking lot. A strangled sob escaped her throat. She slowly turned around, her back pressed against the glass, sliding down until she hit the floor. The diamond ring on her finger suddenly looked ridiculous. A fake shiny bauble on the hand of a completely ruined woman. I walked back to the head of the table and looked at the four of them. My father paralyzed by the destruction of his legacy. My mother sobbing uncontrollably over the loss of her mansion and social standing. My brother completely broken and facing a lifetime of unpayable debt. And my sister-in-law sitting on the floor mourning the loss of a car she never actually owned. They looked like the survivors of a massive shipwreck clinging to the floating debris of their shattered egos. But I was not the rescue boat. I was the storm that sank them. For years they had demanded my respect, while giving me absolutely nothing in return. They had expected me to show up, smile, and play the role of the grateful, quiet failure. They wanted me to be the dark background that made their false gold shine brighter. Tonight they had pushed me into a corner, locked the door, and threatened my freedom. They thought they were trapping a mouse. They did not realize they had locked themselves inside the cage with a predator. Winston finally looked up from the folder on the table. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face utterly defeated. Why did you come tonight, Kendra? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. If you already owned everything, if the paperwork was already signed, why did you even bother showing up to this party? You could have just let the lawyers handle it on Monday. You came here just to watch us bleed. I stood tall, buttoning the front of my bespoke suit jacket. I looked down at the man who had never once defended me, the man who had laughed when his golden son humiliated me in front of 200 people. I did not come here to celebrate your anniversary, I said coldly. I came here to serve you with foreclosure notices. The words hung in the air, cold and immovable. Winston sank back into his chair, the fight completely drained from his body. Vivian continued to weep into her arms, her muffled sobs the only sound breaking the heavy silence. Julian stared blankly at the wall, a broken shell of the arrogant golden child he had been just an hour prior. But Sasha was not done surviving. I watched her slowly pick herself up from the floor by the window. She brushed the invisible dust off her emerald green gown, her eyes darting frantically around the room as she processed her new reality. The gold digger arithmetic in her head was working overtime. Julian was bankrupt. Winston was hopelessly leveraged. The Wilson family name was essentially worthless. There was only one person left in the room with any actual power, and that was me. Sasha walked back toward the mahogany table. She did not look at her husband. She walked right past Julian, intentionally putting physical distance between herself and his sinking ship. She stopped a few feet away from me, her posture entirely transformed. The mocking superior stance she had weaponized in the hallway was gone. In its place was a carefully constructed mask of vulnerability. Kendra, Sasha began, her voice soft, trembling with manufactured emotion. She reached out, attempting to place a comforting hand on my arm. I took a deliberate step back, letting her hand drop awkwardly into the empty space between us. "Do not touch me, Sasha," I warned her, my voice perfectly level. She swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "I understand. I know you are angry. You have every right to be angry at them." She gestured dismissively over her shoulder toward Julian and Winston. "They treated you terribly. I see that now. They lied to you just like they lied to me." Julian lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes widening in disbelief. "Sasha, what are you doing?" He croaked, his voice thick with exhaustion. "Shut up, Julian!" Sasha snapped, not even bothering to turn around. "You do not get to speak to me anymore. You ruined my life. You lied to me every single day." She turned her focus back to me, her eyes brimming with fresh, highly calculated tears. "Kendra, please listen to me. I had absolutely no idea what he was doing. I thought he was a legitimate businessman. He manipulated me. He kept me completely in the dark about the finances. I was just his trophy wife paraded around to make him look successful to his investors. I am a victim here, too." I raised a single eyebrow, letting her spin her desperate web. "A victim?" "Yes," she insisted, stepping closer, lowering her voice into a tone of conspiratorial sisterhood. "We are both victims of the toxic men in this family. Winston and Julian, they only care about themselves. They use women to build their egos. But you and I, Kendra, we are Black women. We have to navigate this elite society, and it is so hard. We have to stick together. You know how rare it is for one of us to make it to the top like you have. I respect you so much for what you built. I always knew you were smarter than them." I almost laughed out loud at the sheer audacity. An hour ago, my $10,000 bespoke suit was a cheap department store rag, ruining her aesthetic. She had ordered me to leave through the service doors so I would not embarrass her brand. Now, suddenly, I was her wealthy, respected sister-in-arms. Sasha pressed her hands together in a pleading gesture. "I have 2 small children to think about, Kendra. Julian is going to drag us all down into the gutter with his fraud charges and his bankruptcy. You cannot let him take me down with him. You own the title to the Buckhead house. You own the cars. Please just let me keep the house and the Mercedes. Or at least hire me at Apex Capital. I can be a massive asset to you. I know all the socialites in Atlanta. I can bring you high net worth clients. Just give me a way out, sister to sister." I stood there, letting her desperate plea echo in the soundproof room. I looked at her panicked, beautiful face. I let a warm, sympathetic smile spread across my lips. Sasha let out a massive sigh of relief, genuinely thinking she had successfully manipulated me. Her shoulders dropped and she offered a tentative, hopeful smile in return. She thought she had found her new meal ticket. "You are absolutely right, Sasha," I said softly, my voice dripping with false empathy. "Black women do need to stick together. We face unique challenges and loyalty is everything. It is so tragic that Julian kept you entirely in the dark. It is tragic that you were just a helpless, innocent wife who knew absolutely nothing about the missing millions." "Yes, exactly," she breathed, nodding eagerly. "Thank you for understanding, Kendra. I knew you would see the truth." I maintained my warm smile as I reached back into my designer tote bag. I felt the thick, heavy manila envelope waiting at the bottom. I pulled it out, the rough paper scraping against the smooth leather of the bag. Which is why I continued, my voice suddenly dropping its warmth and turning into pure, unadulterated ice. "I find it incredibly fascinating that you have been so busy managing his offshore accounts." I threw the manila envelope onto the polished mahogany table. I did not just drop it. I whipped it across the surface with such intense force that the metal clasp broke open upon impact. A cascade of high-definition 8x10 photographs and financial printouts exploded across the wood, sliding directly in front of Julian and Winston. Sasha froze. Her hopeful smile vanished, replaced by a look of absolute paralytic terror. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax figure. She stopped breathing entirely. "What is this?" Winston demanded, leaning forward to look at the glossy photographs scattered across the wood. Julian reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the first photograph. I watched his eyes track the image. It was a crystal-clear, high-resolution shot, taken by the city's most expensive private investigator. It showed Sasha sitting in the dimly lit luxury lounge of the St. Regis Hotel. She was leaning across a small cocktail table, passionately kissing a man who was very clearly not her husband. "Who is that?" Vivian gasped, temporarily stopping her crying to peer over Julian's shoulder. "That," I announced to the room, making sure my voice carried over their shock, "is Terrence, Julian Chief Financial Officer. The man Julian trusted to manage the books for his entire commercial real estate portfolio." Julian dropped the photo as if it had physically burned his fingers. He quickly scrambled to pick up the next one and the next. There were dozens of them. Sasha and Terrence walking into a luxury downtown condo together. Sasha and Terrence drinking expensive champagne on a balcony. Sasha and Terrence boarding a private chartered flight to the Cayman Islands while Julian was desperately in New York begging investors for cash to save his eco-resort. But the photographs were only the appetizer. The real main course was printed on the bank statements underneath them. I pointed to the stack of documents. "Julian, while you were forging documents to extort your little sister tonight, your brilliant wife and your loyal CFO were busy robbing you blind. Terrence has been systematically siphoning the last remaining liquid cash from your shell companies. And Sasha has been moving those funds into a hidden offshore trust in the Caymans, an account securely listed entirely under her maiden name." "No," Julian whispered, his eyes frantically scanning the highlighted bank transfers. Transfers of $50,000, $100,000, $200,000 at a time, totaling over $3 million. The money he thought he had lost to market fluctuations had actually been stolen by the woman sleeping next to him. Sasha backed away from the table, her hands raised defensively. "Julian, it is not what it looks like," she stammered, her voice pitching into a hysterical squeak. "Terrence was just helping me secure a safety net for the kids. I swear I was going to tell you. I was trying to protect our family." Julian stood up. The movement was slow, mechanical, almost robotic. He did not look at the foreclosure notices anymore. He did not care about the bankruptcy or Apex Capital or the fact that his father's legacy was in ruins. The only thing existing in his universe in that exact second was the woman who had publicly degraded him, privately betrayed him, and systematically stolen his last remaining lifeline. "You stole from me," Julian said. His voice was not a scream. It was a low, guttural growl of a man who had completely snapped under the weight of his own destruction. "You slept with my CFO and you stole my money. Julian, please!" Sasha shrieked, taking another step backward until her back hit the heavy oak door of the boardroom. With a sudden, terrifying roar, Julian lunged across the space. He did not walk around the table. He threw his body over the corner of the heavy mahogany wood, sending leather chairs crashing to the floor. The pristine, elegant environment of the country club VIP room instantly shattered into complete chaos. Julian collided with Sasha, pinning her violently against the wood paneling of the door. His hands went straight for her shoulders, shaking her with terrifying force. "Where is my money?" he screamed, spit flying from his lips. "You scheming, gold-digging parasite! I gave you everything. I bought you those diamonds. I bought you that car. Where is the money you and Terrence stole from me?" Sasha screamed, a piercing, deafening sound that echoed brutally in the soundproof room. She clawed at his face with her manicured nails, trying desperately to push him off. "Get off me!" she shrieked, her emerald gown tearing at the shoulder as she struggled against his weight. "You bankrupt loser, get off me!" Winston leaped up from his chair, ignoring his chest pains. "Julian, stop it!" he bellowed, rushing around the table to grab his son from behind. "You are going to kill her. Let her go." Vivian was screaming uncontrollably now, holding her hands over her ears, unable to process the sheer violence erupting in front of her. The polished elite Wilson family had completely descended into a feral physical brawl. Winston wrapped his arms around Julian's waist, trying to haul him backward, but Julian was fueled by pure, unadulterated madness. He thrashed and kicked his expensive velvet dinner jacket, ripping violently at the seams. Sasha managed to break one arm free and slapped Julian hard across the face. The sharp crack of skin on skin echoed loudly. Julian roared again, shoving Winston backward. The older man lost his footing and crashed heavily into the mahogany table, knocking the crystal water pitchers onto the floor, where they shattered into hundreds of glittering sharp shards. I stood perfectly still at the far end of the room, watching the physical destruction of my family. I did not intervene. I did not call for help. I simply observed the violent, chaotic end of their dynasty, knowing that the final trap I set had sprung flawlessly. Winston finally managed to drag Julian backward, throwing his violently thrashing son onto the thick, patterned carpet. Julian lay there, gasping for air, clutching his torn velvet jacket as he stared up at the ceiling in complete shock. Sasha scrambled away, crawling backward until her back hit the far corner of the room. She was crying hysterically, pulling her ripped emerald gown over her bare shoulder, her chest heaving with sheer terror. The room smelled intensely of spilled water, expensive cologne, sweat, and pure, unfiltered adrenaline. The polished mahogany table was a catastrophic disaster of broken crystal pitchers, scattered high-definition photographs, and legally binding foreclosure documents. The physical violence had finally burned itself out, leaving only the cold, bitter ashes of their ruined lives settling over the boardroom. Vivian slowly lowered her trembling hands from her ears. She opened her eyes and looked at the utter wreckage of her family. Her husband was leaning heavily against a leather chair, clutching his chest and breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. Her golden son was a bankrupt, broken mess whimpering on the floor. Her daughter-in-law was an exposed fraud, cowering in the corner like a feral animal. Vivian realized in that exact moment that the internal structure of her family was completely eradicated. There was no love left to salvage. There was no trust left to rebuild. But for Vivian, the internal reality had never truly mattered. The only thing that mattered to her, the only thing she truly valued in her entire superficial existence, was the external perception. She turned her head and looked directly at me. I was the only person in the room still standing perfectly upright, my custom-tailored suit completely untouched, my expression entirely calm and detached. Vivian saw her only remaining lifeline. She took a slow, shaking step toward me, then another, and then the proud, untouchable matriarch of the Wilson family did something I never thought I would witness in my lifetime. She collapsed onto her knees. The heavy imported beads of her custom gown clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. She reached out with both arms, her trembling hands grasping the fabric of my trousers in an act of absolute submission. "Kendra," she sobbed, her voice a raw, pathetic wail that scraped against the soundproof walls. "Please, I am begging you. Look at me. I am on my bare knees begging my own daughter. You have won. You have taken the money, you have taken the commercial properties, you have exposed all the lies. We have absolutely nothing left to fight you with. I concede everything. But please, I am begging you with everything I have left, do not take the family name." I looked down at her tear-streaked face. "Get up, Vivian," I said softly. "You are embarrassing yourself." "No," she cried, tightening her frantic grip on my clothes. "I will not get up until you promise me. We can fix this mess privately. We can sign whatever transfer documents you want right now. Winston and I will publicly disown Julian tomorrow morning. We will throw Sasha out onto the street tonight without a single penny. We will banish them both from Atlanta forever. We will do whatever it takes to satisfy your revenge. Just please keep this inside this room. Let us walk out of those heavy doors with our heads held high. Let us tell the guests that Julian is stepping down for health reasons. Let us control the narrative. Do not let the public know how disgusting and broken we are. Think of our family legacy in Atlanta." Winston found his voice, stepping forward to stand behind his kneeling wife. He looked at me with desperate, pleading eyes that had completely lost their predatory edge. "She is right, Kendra," he rasped, coughing weakly into his fist. "If this gets out, we are not just broke. We are social pariahs. The country club will expel us before midnight. The commercial banks will blacklist us permanently. The charity boards will erase our names from their donor walls. We will be laughing stocks in the only city we have ever called home. You are a brilliant businesswoman. You understand the immense value of a pristine brand. You own our assets now. If you destroy the Wilson name publicly, you damage the value of the very properties you just acquired. Keep it quiet. Let us handle the disgrace behind closed doors. We surrender to you. Just leave us our dignity. I gently reached down and pried Vivian's hands off my trousers, peeling her fingers back one by one. I took a deliberate step back, physically separating myself from her desperate grasp. I looked at the two of them, the architects of my childhood misery, begging me to preserve the very illusion that had kept me exiled in the shadows for 32 years. Your dignity, I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue. The concept tasted like ash in my mouth. You want me to protect your dignity. You sat at that table outside exactly 1 hour ago and laughed with your wealthy friends while your son humiliated me in front of 200 people. You wanted me to be the public joke to elevate your own status. You did not care about my dignity when you threatened to frame me for corporate embezzlement. You did not care about my dignity when you forced me to take out high-interest student loans while you bought Julian a luxury sports car. Your entire legacy is built on the systematic destruction of my self-worth. And now you expect me to protect the very weapon you used to beat me down. I turned my back on them and walked slowly toward the far wall of the VIP boardroom. The rich wood-paneled wall featured a sleek, modern communication console integrated directly into the country club central audio and visual system. It was an advanced Crestron control panel designed specifically to allow corporate executives to pipe music into the room or make direct announcements to the main ballroom during large conventions. You genuinely think you can control the narrative? I said, my back still turned to them as I approached the wall. You think you can walk out of this room, paste those fake, bright smiles back onto your faces, and tell the mayor and the city council that everything is perfectly fine? You think you can go back to your country club luncheons and pretend you are still untouchable royalty while I secretly hold your mortgages in a vault? I stopped directly in front of the console. I reached out and rested my fingertips lightly against the polished metal frame of the control panel. I am a specialist in hostile mergers and acquisitions, I reminded them, my voice echoing clearly and coldly across the ruined room. When I execute a corporate takeover, I do not leave any loose ends. I do not leave the former management in a position where they can spin the truth to the press and launch a public relations recovery campaign. I burn their credibility to the ground so they can never attempt a counterattack. I knew exactly what you would do tonight. I knew you would try to threaten me, and when that failed, I knew you would resort to begging to protect your image. Vivian let out a confused, wet sob from the floor. Kendra, what are you doing? What does that mean? Just promise us you will not tell the guests. We will give you anything. I slowly turned around to face my family. I pointed my index finger directly at the communication console mounted on the wall beside me. Look closely at the panel, Winston, I instructed. Winston squinted, his bloodshot eyes tracking from my face to the metal control board. There was a small, circular LED indicator light, situated at the very top of the panel, right next to the microphone icon. It was glowing a bright, steady, unmistakable green. Winston's brow furrowed in deep confusion. It is green, he said slowly, his brain struggling to process the information. What does a green light mean? I smiled. It was the absolute coldest, most terrifying smile I had offered all evening. It means the microphone is live, Winston. The air in the room seemed to vanish instantly. Vivian stopped crying mid-sob. Julian slowly pushed himself up onto his elbows on the carpet, his bruised face locking onto the glowing green dot. Sasha covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with sudden catastrophic realization. I walked back over to the boardroom table and casually picked up my phone. Before I walked into this room tonight, I made a quick detour to the main audiovisual control booth down the hall. As the majority shareholder of the management group that recently acquired this country club, the security staff was more than happy to grant me full access. I bypassed the standard security protocols and manually linked the microphone array in this VIP boardroom directly to the main speaker system in the grand ballroom. Winston's face turned the color of wet chalk. No, he whispered, taking a stumbling, uncoordinated step backward. No, you did not. You could not have done that. I absolutely did. Winston. I confirmed, my voice ringing with total, unyielding victory. For the last 45 minutes, this room has not been soundproof. Every single word spoken in here has been broadcast live, in crystal clear high-definition audio directly to the 200 elite guests sitting in the ballroom. The silence that followed my declaration was the most profound, heavy silence I had ever experienced in my entire life. It was the silence of total, absolute death. The instant, irreversible death of a dynasty. They heard it all. Winston, I continued pacing back down the length of the room, forcing them to look at me, forcing them to absorb the sheer crushing magnitude of their destruction. They heard Julian admit to being $15 million in debt. They heard him confess to faking his financial projections. They heard Vivian threaten to forge embezzlement records to send me to federal prison. They heard Sasha scream about divorcing her bankrupt husband and draining the joint accounts. And they heard the loud, unmistakable sounds of Julian violently attacking his own wife after discovering she was sleeping with his chief financial officer and hiding millions in offshore accounts. Julian let out a horrifying primal scream. He scrambled to his feet and lunged toward the communication console, wildly slapping his hands against the buttons, desperately trying to turn the system off. He pounded his fists against the metal, sobbing hysterically as he realized the system was locked out. The damage was permanently, irreversibly done. Vivian curled into a tight fetal position on the hardwood floor, burying her face in her arms, moaning in absolute agony. Her reputation, her social standing, her entire identity was completely vaporized. The mayor had heard her extortion threats. The charity board members had heard her call her daughter-in-law a gold-digging parasite. The investors had heard her husband admit his empire was leveraged to the point of collapse. She could never show her face in the city of Atlanta ever again. Winston leaned heavily against the wall, sliding down slowly until he was sitting defeated on the floor. He stared blankly ahead, his eyes completely vacant. The great patriarch was gone. He was just a ruined, bankrupt old man whose entire life work had been publicly exposed as a mountain of lies and fraud. I walked toward the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. I did not look back at them. There was nothing left to see. The predators had been thoroughly slaughtered, not by my hands, but by their own greed and arrogance broadcast for the entire world to hear. I reached out and grasped the heavy brass handle of the door. I pulled it open. As the thick acoustic seal broke the sound from the outside corridor, flooded into the room. It was not the sound of a lively, joyous anniversary gala. There was no jazz music playing. There was no clinking of crystal champagne glasses. There was no polite, wealthy laughter. Instead, the grand ballroom was echoing with a chaotic, deafening roar of absolute shock and outrage. I could hear angry voices shouting. I could hear people demanding answers from the club staff. I could hear the distinct, frantic sound of 200 members of the Atlanta elite scrambling to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Wilson family collapse. The investors were likely already calling their lawyers in the parking lot to pull their funds. The politicians were running for the exits to avoid being photographed near confessed felons. The legacy they had begged me to protect was instantly, permanently dead. Through the open doorway, the chaotic noise of the grand ballroom swelled into a deafening crescendo. The high society guests were in a state of absolute uproar. But before anyone from the crowd could approach the VIP boardroom to witness the carnage firsthand, a tall, impeccably dressed man pushed his way through the gathering crowd. It was Mr. Sterling, the general manager of the Atlanta Country Club. He was a man known for his rigid adherence to protocol and his legendary discretion. Tonight, however, his face was carved out of stone. Flanking Mr. Sterling were 4 massive security guards dressed in sharp black suits. They were built like linebackers, their sheer physical presence radiating a silent, lethal authority. They stepped into the ruined boardroom, their heavy black boots crunching over the shattered crystal from the broken water pitchers. Winston saw the manager, and a brief, pathetic flicker of hope ignited in his dull eyes. He pushed himself off the wall, summoning whatever tiny fraction of his patriarch persona remained. Sterling Winston barked, his voice hoarse and trembling. "Thank God you are here. Get your security team to arrest this woman immediately. She hacked your audio system. She is trying to extort us. I want her physically removed from the premises, and I want you to call the police. I am a founding platinum member of this club, and I demand you protect my family." Vivian scrambled up from the floor, wiping her ruined makeup with the back of her trembling hand. "Yes," she cried out, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Throw her out. She is a lunatic. She attacked us. Call the police right now, Arthur. We pay your salary." Mr. Sterling did not even blink. He did not look at Winston. He did not look at Vivian. He did not acknowledge the sobbing Sasha or the battered, bleeding Julian lying on the carpet. He walked straight past the ruined family, his polished shoes stepping carefully over the legal documents scattered across the floor. He stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me. He placed his hands behind his back and offered a deep, highly respectful bow. "Good evening, Miss Wilson," Mr. Sterling said, his voice carrying the perfect tone of absolute professional deference. "The audio broadcast has been terminated from the main control booth as you requested. The ballroom has been secured. Are you unharmed, ma'am?" I smoothed the lapels of my tailored jacket. "I am perfectly fine, Mr. Sterling. Thank you for your prompt arrival." Winston's jaw went completely slack. He stared at the general manager as if the man had just started speaking in a foreign language. "Sterling, what are you doing?" Winston demanded, his voice pitching upward in pure panic. "Why are you bowing to her? She is the one who caused this disturbance. I demand you throw her out. Do you know who I am?" Mr. Sterling finally turned to look at my father. His expression was a masterclass in polite corporate disdain. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Wilson," the manager replied coldly. "You are a guest whose membership was officially revoked 10 minutes ago due to gross violation of our conduct policy, and I am bowing to this woman because I report directly to her." Vivian let out a sharp, confused gasp. "Report to her? What are you talking about? She does not own this club." "She owns the management group that operates this club, Vivian," I clarified, stepping forward so I was standing shoulder to shoulder with my general manager. "Did you really think I would choose this specific venue for your anniversary gala by pure coincidence?" Apex Capital quietly acquired the hospitality conglomerate that runs this entire property 2 months ago. I am not just a member here. I am essentially the owner of the ground you are currently bleeding on, which means as of this exact moment you are formally trespassing on my private property. Julian let out a low, agonizing groan from the floor, curling into a tighter ball. The final avenue of escape had been slammed shut and locked from the outside. They were completely surrounded by a world I now owned. "Mr. Sterling," I said, not taking my eyes off my parents, "please escort these unauthorized individuals off the premises. If they resist, your team is authorized to use whatever physical force is necessary to remove them. They are no longer welcome here, ever again." "Understood, ma'am," Mr. Sterling replied with a sharp nod. He turned to the 4 massive security guards standing at attention near the door. "Remove them," he ordered simply. The guards moved with terrifying, coordinated efficiency. 2 of them stepped toward Julian. They reached down, grabbed him by the arms of his torn velvet jacket, and hauled him roughly to his feet. Julian tried to thrash, a weak, pathetic attempt to preserve his crushed ego. "Get your hands off me," he slurred, spitting blood onto the carpet. "I will sue you. I will sue this entire club." The larger of the 2 guards simply twisted Julian's arm sharply behind his back, causing the former golden boy to let out a sharp yelp of pain. "You do not have the money to sue anyone, sir," the guard grunted, shoving Julian forcefully toward the open doorway. "Keep moving." A 3rd guard approached Sasha. She was still cowering in the corner, holding the ripped shoulder of her emerald green gown together. When the massive man reached out for her, she scrambled to her feet, sobbing uncontrollably. "Do not touch me," she wept, her mascara running in thick black rivers down her cheeks. "I will walk. Just do not touch me." She stumbled forward on her expensive heels, her diamond ring catching the harsh light one last time as she followed her disgraced husband toward the exit. The 4th guard walked toward my parents. Winston did not put up a fight. He looked completely and utterly broken. The decades of carefully cultivated arrogance, the absolute certainty of his own superiority, had been entirely hollowed out. He looked like an empty shell of a man. He simply nodded, lowering his head, and began to shuffle toward the door, like a prisoner walking to the gallows. But Vivian refused to surrender her illusion quietly. When the guard reached for her arm, she shrieked and threw herself backward, landing hard on her knees. "No!" she screamed, thrashing wildly. "I am Vivian Wilson. I am the guest of honor tonight. You cannot throw me out of my own anniversary party. My friends are out there. The mayor is out there." The security guard did not hesitate. He reached down, grabbed Vivian by her upper arms, and hoisted her bodily off the floor. She kicked and screamed, her designer heels flying off her feet, but the guard carried her forward with effortless, brutal efficiency. I followed closely behind them as they were marched out of the VIP boardroom and into the wide velvet-lined corridor. As we approached the grand double doors leading into the main ballroom, the chaotic noise from the crowd suddenly died down. A heavy, expectant silence fell over the 200 elite guests. The security guards pushed the double doors wide open. The walk of shame began. The massive ballroom was a sea of glittering gowns, sharp tuxedos, and horrified faces. As my family was marched into the room, the crowd parted instantly, creating a wide, empty path straight down the center toward the main lobby. It was like watching the Red Sea part driven back not by a miracle, but by sheer contagious disgust. Nobody wanted to be anywhere near the radioactive fallout of the Wilson family. I walked a few paces behind the security detail, my head held high, my posture immaculate. I watched the guests react to the spectacle. These were the same people who had laughed at my expense just an hour ago. Now their eyes were wide with shock and judgment. Vivian, still struggling in the grip of the security guard, looked frantically around the room. She saw her closest friends, the women she hosted for weekly charity brunches. "Martha!" Vivian cried out, reaching a desperate hand toward a woman in a diamond necklace. "Martha, tell them to stop. Tell them there has been a terrible mistake." Martha did not step forward to help. She took a deliberate step backward, turning her face away completely, refusing to even make eye contact with the disgraced socialite. Vivian let out a devastated wail as she realized her social currency was completely bankrupt. Julian was marched through the crowd with his arm twisted behind his back, his face bruised and bleeding from the fight with Sasha. He tried to hide his face, hanging his head low, but the bright chandeliers illuminated every single tear, every single bruise, every single shred of his ruined pride. Investors who had shaken his hand earlier in the evening now stared at him with naked fury, realizing he had tried to scam them out of millions to fund a fake empire. Winston walked in silence, staring blankly at the marble floor. He passed the mayor, a man he had donated heavily to a man he considered a close political ally. The mayor actively turned his back as Winston passed, signaling the permanent end of my father's political influence in the city of Atlanta. Sasha sobbed loudly, tripping over the hem of her ripped emerald gown. She looked like a cheap, discarded prop. The women who had admired her massive diamond ring an hour ago now whispered viciously behind their hands, knowing she had been sleeping with her husband's CFO and stealing from a bankrupt company. The agonizingly long walk across the massive ballroom floor felt like it took an eternity. Every step was a permanent stain on their legacy. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I had simply held up a mirror and the reflection had destroyed them. The security guards pushed them through the grand lobby and out the heavy glass front doors of the country club. The crisp, cool night air of Atlanta hit us immediately. The valet area, usually a symphony of arriving luxury vehicles and polite attendants, was bathed in the harsh, flashing yellow strobe lights of two massive commercial tow trucks. The trap I had set was comprehensive. I had timed it perfectly. As the security guards dragged my family to the edge of the circular driveway, Julian let out a hoarse cry. "Oh my God," he choked out, struggling weakly against the guard grip. There, sitting on the flatbed of the first tow truck, was Julian leased silver Porsche. And hooked to the heavy winch of the second tow truck, its front wheels already hoisted into the air, was Sasha's beloved black Mercedes G-Wagon. The repo men, working directly under the orders of Apex Capital, were securing the heavy chains around the tires. Sasha broke free from her guard and ran toward the tow truck, waving her arms hysterically. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill shriek. "You cannot take that. My purse is in there. My house keys are in there." Stop! The repo man did not even look at her. He pulled a heavy lever on the side of his truck, and the winch groaned loudly, pulling the Mercedes higher into the air. The harsh mechanical sound was the final death knell of their billionaire facade. The security guards released Julian and Winston, pushing them roughly past the velvet ropes and onto the cold concrete of the public sidewalk just outside the club property line. They dropped Vivian unceremoniously onto the curb. She collapsed onto the hard concrete, her expensive beaded gown scraping against the dirt, her bare feet exposed to the cold night air. I stopped at the top of the grand marble steps leading up to the country club entrance. Mr. Sterling stood respectfully, one step behind me, flanked by the security detail. I looked down at the four of them stranded on the street. They had no money, no credit, no cars, and soon they would have no homes. The legacy they had tried to protect by sacrificing my future was now a smoldering pile of toxic ashes. Julian looked up at me from the sidewalk. His face was a mask of pure defeat. He knew there was no coming back from this. The media would have the story by morning. The creditors would swarm like vultures by noon. Winston sat down heavily on the curb next to his weeping wife, wrapping his arms around his knees like a lost, confused child. He did not look at me. He just stared at the flashing yellow lights of the tow trucks driving away, taking the last remnants of his fake empire with them. I stood in the crisp night air, inhaling deeply. The suffocating weight I had carried for 32 years was finally completely gone. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was the architect of my own absolute victory.